Hello and welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook. I'm Robin Hunicke and I'm here today with Austin Wintory, a dear friend, composer, explorer, emotional astronaut. And he's going to give you a little bit of an introduction of himself and talk a little bit today with me about working on Journey and Luna, which we both collaborated on, and some of the adventures that we've both had in thinking about how to make games part of a process that grows us both mentally and emotionally, and to some extent spiritually. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Welcome to the podcast, Austin.
Thank
How are you?
I'm great, Robin.
I think that you might need to introduce yourself just briefly for those of the audience who haven't already listened to you doing these podcasts yourself. Why don't you tell us a little about who you are?
I am Austin. I'm a composer.
Yes.
I have done a handful of games. And obviously, we worked together on Journey.
We did.
I worked previously with That Game Company on their debut title, Flow. And then after that, a very schizophrenic smattering of games along the spectrum of Andy Schatz's Monaco and Tooth and Tail, the Leisure Suit Larry remake, and then Assassin's Creed Syndicate,
Luna,
Matt Nava's Giant Squid debut title, and then of course Funomena's beautiful sort of musical tone poem, interactive diorama, Luna.
That's right. Which is actually coming out for the PlayStation, PSVR, and PlayStation 4 and PS Pro on June 18th.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't it this week? Yeah, okay, next week.
Now, yeah, it's amazing.
Long time coming.
Yes,
I think that game was started in 2001.
Funomena likes to start games and take a really long time to get them to all the platforms. That's our plan.
Yeah, well, deservedly so.
So you're a composer and you've worked on a variety of games, most of them independent titles, but not all of them independent titles. Some of them are, like you said, like the Assassin's Creed titles and stuff, some really big stuff. Why don't we talk a little bit about how you got started in games? Because you didn't necessarily start off thinking this was going to be your career path, right?
No, absolutely. I was always a diehard gamer, so it was kind of inevitable, seemingly, or one would think. Because I would always, at any point in my life where that kind of intersection would occur, I would be all too happy to do games. So it seems like it was just sort of whenever opportunity would strike. But I wasn't conscientiously pursuing it, mainly because I didn't know you could. This was, back in 2003, 2004, and we were at the very beginnings of the kind of mainstream notion of a freelance composer in games, because the majority of game composers in the 90s
were in-house, right?
Were staff positions. Yeah, so all my heroes were people like Peter McConnell, who just was on staff at LucasArts doing the Tim Schafer, Ron Gilbert games as just part of his job. Oh yeah, to this day I worship him. I keep emailing him to find out when we're going to all be in the same, so we can drag him into this podcast, because he's like a legend in his own times. And so I was very inspired by that. But I also, I wasn't jonesing to get a staff job either. Yeah. So it was like, I thought games, I didn't really know realistically how that would be. And then, in school at USC, one day I was at a concert and I saw this guy. It was a choir concert, and it was like the worst choirs. I was in the choir. That's why I was there. And it was like this thing you had to do as part of the major. And there was this guy in the audience. There was like the only one in the audience. And he's like this super muscular, jack, G.I. Joe looking dude. And I thought, now that's violating all the cliches that my brain wants to impose on a choral audience member. So I went and introduced myself just to know who this guy is. And he was an ROTC student at USC in their inaugural class for their new game design program. I had no idea that was even a thing. I was there, trying to meet student filmmakers and stuff, but I did not know that there was game design. So, whip out my card, very dutifully, little 20-year-old annoying
Student
networker.
card, that's
right. Very obnoxiously like, well, you probably are going to need music. Well, astonishingly, a couple days later, he actually called me and said, turns out I actually do. And he was doing this kind of Pac-Man turned all military. Being an ROTC student, I guess it couldn't escape the assumptions that would be made about his interest in game design, because it was like Pac-Man, but you lay mines and stuff. And,
oh, wow.
And anyway, it was a little student game. I wrote like a minute of music. And then a month later, I get an email out of the blue from a classmate of his, Genova, who said, I'm working on my thesis and I need a composer / sound creator, however he phrased it. Linked to a little article about flow theory of Csikszentmihalyi, and I had no idea what to expect. In my mind, games were still predominantly, I was really into the point-and-click adventure games. I also love strategy games, but still, like the general notion of AAA is kind of what the landscape was dominated by overwhelmingly.
There was no such thing as digital distribution, so
no, yeah,
it's
indie
funny.
wasn't a thing to me. I'm sure it existed in a kind of underground way.
It did, because right around that time was when I was working on the very first game jams that had ever happened, and those were the first digital games that were made at game jams and then released on the internet, right? And Genova actually reached out to me around that same time when he was working on the game to ask me about my thesis at my PhD work at University of Chicago, which was on dynamic difficulty adjustment. And so at the same time that Genova was reaching out to you for music, he was reaching out to me, asking me for an advanced copy of my thesis so that he could apply it to his own game design.
Putting us on a collision course. It's like in Chernobyl when they're like, the dice was cast. There was no turning back.
I should dig up that email, because we've been friends for 10 years now. And that really that same time frame, Genova was just reaching out to everybody, trying to figure out.
How did you even know about your?
He'd read about my thesis, and because he'd been looking into AI for the game, and I had organized a symposium with Will Wright and a bunch of other people for the AAAI symposium series on game design and game AI, and actually it was even more strange. That's where I met Will, and Will is the person that ended up recruiting me out of my graduate program just before finishing my PhD to work on The Sims. And Will also recruited Genova out of school to work on Spore. So all of our lives.
There's only 6 people in the game industry.
Yeah, exactly. We're bound to be linked together through this process. So Genova reached out, and I know what that feels like because he did the same thing to me later for Journey.
Yeah.
He reaches out and he says, I have a vision and I'm ready to go. I need you to help me make this thing real, right? And then it's this really intense process of collaborating and working together. When you did the music for Flow, you were working in a sort of a digital space, and you were kind of thinking a lot about digital music and kind of closer to a Brian Eno maybe than an orchestra, right?
I got called, after it came out, I got called the Brian Eno of games, which is hilarious. I always thought that was funny because it was my first time experimenting with electronic music and my first time doing interactive music. I was like this nerd who had been conducting his high school orchestra and had a very classical, not just training, but way of thinking. And so it was this massive, it's like taking shrooms where just the walls of reality peel back and you see so much more. I actually do mean that in earnest, because Genova and Nick working together on this little student project radically changed what I thought music, art, interactivity, games, all in the course of 3 months, my calibration for understanding this medium, as much as a gamer as I was, and someone who had whole childhood was reading my monthly, electronic gaming monthly and
EGM.
PC Gamer and
getting those cheat codes.
Exactly.
Put your Game Shark on your Nintendo.
Yeah, yep. All that. As much as all that felt like me, it was this flash of, wow, I don't know anything. And in fact, maybe no one knows anything because this industry has not found its true self yet.
Yeah.
And that it's going to be a much broader and more sort of diverse array of expression. and I couldn't have articulated any of this at the time. I was just mostly terrified because I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. But we did this little thing, and
it did well. The game came out. It was critically acclaimed. It didn't sell a lot.
Well, that's later.
Yeah, I mean,
this was a Flash.
This was just the student
it was
demo,
a little browser
right?
thing.
So when it first came out, it was like blew up the servers, people clicking on it. There were a lot of people trying to play it.
USC's
stuff.
website.
USC website, And then eventually they did end up getting a 3-game deal with Sony.
Yeah.
And you work with them on the commercial release, and it came out, and
Yep.
it was critically acclaimed.
And we won the very prestigious downloadable game of the year at GDC.
Think about that.
A very relevant category today. I don't know when they stopped that, but that probably wasn't long after that died.
Yeah. It was definitely one of those times where we were all trying to catch up with each other. There was
I'm sure
there was no. It's the equivalent of the Alt Controller Award now. I think that's that's sort of where we are. But it came out and it did kind of well enough that they were able to get a second game deal, and then eventually to make Journey. So between Flow and Journey, what were you doing?
So I guess that's like almost 2 years or so, a year and a half.
Yeah.
That Flower, I think it was a year and a half, something like. It's funny. It felt like a long period because I was so excited to be back in the trenches with the group on Journey and to meet obviously all these new people that had come on board that weren't there for Flow.
Yeah.
Namely you,
myself, employee number 6,
and yep. But yeah, I did a lot of independent films. I was doing a lot of, it's like movies that you've never heard of, most of which that's good. They're not recommended.
So you were practicing. You were kind of skill building.
That's a good way to put it. No, that's a really good. Yeah, exactly. I was honing and pushing and also just engaging in the industry more. I was going to GDC and things like that in that time because I had gotten a taste of something way bigger than I had thought it was. I didn't really know. It's like, because if you don't know anything, if you're just a gamer, then games are like Activision, Sony, Microsoft, Bethesda, et cetera.
Well, it used to be that way. I don't think it's that way
anymore. That's what I mean. Yeah, no, exactly.
But back then, it was like you went to a store, you saw, games on discs. My first 5 titles were all disc-based titles that had to go through a major publisher, and
there weren't very many of those.
Yeah, and it was very hard to get one of those jobs. I mean, I think we both basically magicked into the games industry in a very bizarre way, right? You're at school and you have this connection. I'm at school and I have this connection, and those things lead to these other jobs. But the games industry then was pretty small. Like GDC in 2000, 2001, it was maybe 7,000 to 10,000 developers total, and now it's like over 30,000 people. So, the industry has totally changed. So you're skill building and you're doing these films and you're still hanging out in the games industry. Did you ever get to a place where you thought, oh, it's not going to happen, I'm just going to end up being a film composer? Or did you know at some point that you would end up doing more games?
Well, I would never say I knew. I mean, hell, I still have existential doubt daily. So, I mean, I definitely would have had that then, but in a way that's not unusual to any normal day. It was, but I was always looking for opportunity. And of course, the funny thing was that Flow worked for me as much as it worked against me, because being the Brian Eno of games turned out wasn't highly in demand. And so,
I love Brian Eno. I have his strategies on my desk, and I'm always looking at the oblique strategies and sort of thinking about Brian Eno almost every day. I think he's amazing.
He's one of those guys, kind of like John Cage or somebody who's as much a sort of like art philosopher in a way as he is a musician. And
I went to see a talk by him and Will Wright at one point in San Francisco for the Long Now, and it blew my mind, and I'll never forget it. I still have the little Long Now note card that you're supposed to turn in for questions. I just used it for notes. I still have it in my kit. So you were in this envelope that maybe you didn't want to be in, and then a bunch of stuff happens. Genova reaches out to me and says, will you be the lead designer on Journey? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Let me interview your team. And I go and interview the team. And I'm like, you don't need a lead designer. You already have one. His name is Nick. Why don't we make me the executive producer, and I'll take care of the hiring and pulling the team together. And then at the same time, he reaches out to you and says, would you like to audition for Journey? Did he audition you? It was sort of nebulous. How did it work?
I think in the eyes of Sony, it was technically a kind of standard demo process, but Genova approached it very much as, it would be great to collaborate again, and it would be wonderful to just kind of start with some basic theme that everybody can listen to and kind of, I'm paraphrasing how he put it because I actually can't remember how he phrased it, but the idea was, because emotion leads the design process so much with TGC and particularly on Journey, it was like, if we had a piece of music that we could sort of agree we all feel the same way about, that helps early on in the way that concept art helps.
Yes.
It's a musical equivalent of that, I guess. So he said, will you write something? And I went down. I remember we had dinner, and I thought it was going to be like small talk. Genova doesn't do that.
No, he does not.
So it was like straight into, okay, here's the game. You start in the desert. And I remember writing all these notes. Actually, it's funny because I'll never forget. I ran up. I really thought it was going to be a social, like, hey, it's been a while, let's hang out. And I was unprepared for the meeting that we were actually having.
He was like, let's just have coffee. And then he's like showing me this pitch deck. And I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, I got to go back to my actual job now at EA.
Yeah,
so
and give
weird.
them my notice.
And give my notice, right.
Yeah, it was similar tone. And so I remember I ran up to the host desk and said, do you have any paper? I need to take notes. And they were like, we got nothing. And then I saw a receipt printing, and I said, isn't there like a button that just ejects blank paper? So I had this scroll that was
so
long
great.
and winding.
So
that was
appropriate
all
for
my
the game.
initial. I know. If you kind of squint at it, it looks like the scarf, with all these weird bad writing. And so then I went in the next day or a couple days later or something, and we looked at a little bit more. We talked about kind of the stages at that point. I think it was going to be just sort of 4 main areas. But the basics were already pretty much in place of an open desert culminating in kind of a hostile mountaintop.
And they were actually working at this time on a demo, kind of animatic that we were going to show to Sony to get the game fully greenlit, because we were definitely in the process of negotiating the budget at that time, and they were developing this animatic, and so Matt had started to do some previs on the scale of the world and the way that it felt to pass through that last space, which actually was more like a plain that you walked across, and then there was like a mountain range with a big slit in it that you were supposed to walk through. It was like a canyon.
It's like the Sook.
Yeah, like a slot canyon.
At Petra, there's like this little narrow crack in the canyon wall that you have to walk through.
And there was a dragon in there, and there was all kinds of cool stuff. And it was really kind of almost like a samurai walking across the desert.
Looked like this ninja.
Yeah, we called it the ninja, right? And that character kind of became the beginning of the game. So the first notes of that demo video are the themes of the Journey score.
Yep.
And then that kind of built out everything else. And I remember working across the game with you on several phases of the score. First, just blocking out the feeling, then starting to think about players playing together, then working out the mechanics of like where you would be in the game and how the themes would come together. And my recollection of the process is that it was highly interactive in phases, and that there'd be sort of phases of intense connection where we were working together, all 3 of us, or sometimes 4 of us if Matt was in the room. And then there'd be a phase where you'd go off and do some stuff, and then you'd come back and we'd do it again. And then towards the end, it was really highly interactive, like I would say in the last year, because it took a lot longer than we thought it was going to take. It was supposed to take 1.5 years, and it took 3. So we had to extend the game like 4 times.
Yep.
But towards the end, we were doing the thing where I would make a build and send it to you, and Genova would have notes, and we would have hooks that we had put into the game code. We'd send them over to you. You would create the pieces and play the music against the visuals of the game build that we gave you. And then the pieces would come back, and Genova and I would hook them into the game, and then we would play it, and then we'd give you notes, and you'd go back and forth that way. So by the end of the process, we were almost weekly changing out pieces of the music and playing together. Like we would sit down, and I would play one character and he'd play the other, and we'd listen and experiment with like how it felt to go alone through something versus together. It was a really intensive process. Like I've made a bunch of games, but many games. I've been making games for 20 years. And I feel like the process of building out the interactive score for Journey was one of the most, involved and dynamic processes, because it affected the game design and the art direction at the same time.
Riffed off each other a lot.
Yeah, so Matt was always changing the visuals based on the audio, and he would often listen to the score on his headphones without actually playing the game while drawing, and then draw concept art or think about ways to change the particle systems and the lighting to reflect what the music was making him feel. So it really was a very integrated process, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. And everything you're saying, obviously I had never experienced anything like that. I mean, Flow was, ironically, because Genova was working with Will Wright on Spore, he was kind of shadow directing Flow, and Kelly was really the main driving force. But it was so much more narrow in scope that even though it felt at the time like this just unimaginably huge task.
Yeah. Well, it was the first game.
It's my first commercial.
And building a game on the PlayStation for the first time for any team, especially a team like that that's just out of college, no one's worked anywhere else.
Well, and the
it's
PS3
amazing that
was
it
not,
shipped.
Yeah,
You know?
Oh, for sure, and
that it ran. John Blow did some coding on it. You know,
That's
like
right.
there was like they had to
forget
bring
that.
people in to get it to frame rate because it was kind of a dog, right?
Yeah, well, and as I recall, also, I mean, the PS3 was this big unknown because PS2 was still technically the main console.
Yeah.
Flow was gonna be a PS3 launch title, and like all other games, it slipped late, so it was, it was a few months into it or whatever.
No one
but
ever remembers whether a
Yeah,
game shipped
exactly.
on time.
yeah,
We
it's
never,
so true.
no one ever says to us, you know what? The one problem with Journey is it didn't ship on time.
It's true. We had these people that were holding out for a summer 2011, and they were like, "Fuck you guys." So yeah, everything you're saying is right, and it was joyous, even if it was kind of exhausting and terrifying, because I was always so enamored of the game. It was one of those that I thought, I have no idea if the general public will take to this, but they are making the thing that they talk about. Like they say to people these really lofty goals.
It's feeling directed design. It was MDA done the right way from the very beginning. Absolutely no constraint other than it has to make you feel connected with a stranger in this interesting and new way, right?
Yeah, and it was doing that. It was really like obviously there's all these
At the end it was.
Well, that's the thing. From my perspective, I've come to appreciate in the
you're
the years
outside.
since.
Yeah, you're outside the bubble, so you didn't feel all the pressure that we did.
Yeah, I felt in hindsight, I'm so grateful. I had no idea how shielded I was, because when the game shipped, I was like, what an amazing happy family. We've all birthed this child, and everyone was like, let's all never speak to each other again.
It was a nightmare. I think that actually one of the things that we learned on that process, and so Martin and I actually, after Journey shipped, we left and founded Funomena, and then we worked with you again on Luna. I think one of the things that we took away from that process was a highly interactive process is really healthy. And working with a sound designer from very early on and a composer from very early on is so important.
Absolutely.
And being able to handle the uncertainty of not knowing where you're going is also important. So it's important to recognize that when you're building something groundbreaking or new, which is like basically all Funomena does, it's all TGC does. There are very few game companies in the world that do what we do, which is always ask the hard questions about what the new format is going to be like. What's it like to build a game for an emerging platform? What's it like to build a game that tries to create new feelings? What are the mechanics that create new feelings? That kind of design process, what we learned on Journey is that it is rife with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so the number one takeaway for Martin and I, and then in founding Funomena, was building a deliberately open and communicative team that when you don't know, you can say you don't know, and you can say it without shame or fear. Because if you can do that, then you can harness the uncertainty and build a creative process, but you don't have to have the ego attachment to being right, which can lead to fights and people disagreeing and having these long battles over features in the game, which was some of the stuff that characterized the production of Journey. And as the person that was responsible for that, I really wanted to move away from that kind of production vibe, and like trying to control it in that environment led me to founding a company where we could have the values that I felt would contribute to making new things without as much conflict. So,
well, it's just hard, because Journey demanded it. By the end, everyone, I think, on the team, even folks on the Sony side, like Steve Johnson, the sound designer, I feel like everybody gave everything they had. And when you bare your soul that much, you have such creative ownership over it that when someone has like a different idea, it becomes this almost like an attack on you, which is ultimately working through the kind of creative conflict. To me, will yield a better product if you can kind of develop the skills for working through that, as opposed to this straight and narrow, like, look, I'm just going to throw some music over the fence, put it in the game however is right. And if everyone kind of stays in their lane and is very sort of conservative, you will end up with a game that
absolutely
doesn't challenge anything. And that journey, there's not enough to journey where if it's not challenging those norms, it's just like the world's easiest platformer.
Walking through space.
Yeah.
When we talk about this in the program that I have at UC Santa Cruz, the students always say like, well, we want to make really innovative stuff. Does that mean that we have to suffer? Does that mean that we have to be like, does it have to be miserable? And the answer is yes and no, right? Like, yes, you have to suffer the uncertainty, but you only suffer as much as you attach your ego to being right. And as you learn over time, you can throw something in the game and like think it's going to be amazing and it'll be totally shitty. And then there can be a bug and people are playing it and they go, "This is amazing," and you're like, "I didn't even do that on purpose." Like that's actually an accident, right?
That kind of stuff happens so much.
It does. It really does.
Does
it happen with the music? I think is the question that I have for you.
Oh yeah.
So do you feel that like that process is? I mean, you work predominantly by yourself in a sense, but then you're collaborating with a team, right? As a composer, how does it feel for you? Because like you said, you were isolated from that process, right? Like you weren't in the process every day. You were glancing.
Everyday life.
What's it like to be on the outside and then to be coming into a process and out of a process? What's that feel like for you?
It's interesting because I try to be as inside as I can, just because I like to know the temperature of everything. I like to know the when the shifts in the wind start to happen. I like to be. It's like a flock of birds. You want to be able to move in that kind of telepathic way, and so I try to integrate as much as possible. Also because there's always a certain amount of catch up if you're not embedded 100% with like an on-site office or something. There's a certain amount of catch up to all the iteration of the design and the specific feeling, and even sometimes really fundamental. I mean, like on Luna, not to skip ahead, but like I remember it was supposed to be a touch interface iPad
That's
game.
right. We started off as an iPad game.
Yeah, and so it's like wanting to be as close to the team as possible so that when there's this sudden revelation of, what would this be like as a VR experience?
Yeah.
And that really changes everything about the design decision. That's a foundational shift in the game. Journey didn't, I think, go through that seismic of a kind of reorientation.
It kind of did. I mean, when we started, we were going to do a 4-player multiplayer game, and it was top down. And then we moved from 2D to 3D and went from 4 players to 2. And even the 2D to 3D change, like I gave a talk about that at IndieCade the year that we did it. It was brutal. Like a lot of the design that we had done in the early prototype, which was top down, involved fog of war and field of view changing.
Actually, I remember those.
And then when we went to 3D, like I had to walk through the entire game design again from the perspective that you could go over a hill and never see what was behind you and never even think about it.
Right.
Whereas when you're looking top down, it's kind of like there's like a little, almost like it's like a piano roll. You have a memory of what you saw, and you can always roll back and go forward. And it's much easier to remember, because of the way our minds work, the visual landscape of a top-down map than it is for us to remember the visual landscape of a 3D space moving through time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's why Google Maps is a top-down map, right? Like if it was a 3D map walking, you can look at it that way, but people don't. People don't navigate Google Maps by looking at the street view. It's street view is what you do once you get to where you want to go to see the building you want to see.
Yep.
And so that change alone, just moving from 2D to 3D at the beginning of the project, definitely extended the timeline, and it definitely changed it. So I would say that it did. But at any rate, you like to be in the space of
being as close as possible to
seeing that stuff happen.
Yeah, to be on the forefront of that, so that I'm because I'm always playing catch up to a degree, no matter what. And so that minimizes that. But at the same time, I also like that the separation. I don't go out of my way to cause this because it's going to happen inevitably. But the separation also lets me be kind of like the slightly. It's like I'm the most objective member of the team in a way.
Yeah.
Because I'm able to see it, even if it's every couple of days. That's still quite a lot of
you see
interaction.
progress.
But I can see, here's what you're making, irrespective of what you think you're making, and I can try to score, some compromise between this idealized vision of it, but then also the reality of what it is, and try to make the music sort of try to capture both. Whereas if I was truly and totally on the inside, I think I would have the same objectivity issue that anybody else has when they're making anything. But I also, it's like the trade-offs are such that I ultimately would rather err on that side than like being too close, as it were. Because there is no such thing as actually too close. But I'd rather err on that than be, overly valuing that objectivity and keeping my distance because,
Right.
at the end of the day, there's also a certain amount of just as a professional, you learn that objectivity like a muscle that you just kind of work, like you learn to kind of whatever tricks you need to sort of reboot your brain and step back and say, okay,
what if I was someone else?
yeah, exactly.
Like, what if I was a player that had never seen this before, right? That's what we're constantly doing this as game designers,
the play
looking at our
test,
games that way.
I keep bumping the legs of this table and I'm sure the mic is like, none of this is being recorded. There's just a loose cable under the, so I remember I'd never, been to playtests before until on Journey we would go to Sony and see the TV monitors of their faces.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind, and that witnessing that a bunch of times really also changed my thinking of the music, partly because it made me just see how intimate the experience was for players. Like they're inches away from the screen. And because, you think of Journey as this big landscape, and I'm thinking of the music as, like a solo cello that's ringing out and feels very alone and what, but it's actually in a way very claustrophobic because the actual act of playing it is so private and intimate. It's not a couch multiplayer game. It's not an esport, not that esports really existed then, but it's not a big spectacle sort of thing. And that it really helped frame my mind between reconciling that sort of extreme sense of expanse and also the extreme sort of quietness of it, just watching players, not to mention just the pragmatic of like, when there'd be I remember we had this jump scare with the sort of guardian coming up out of the ground, and people, I remember the team adjusting, like with Matt, the kind of color saturation almost of the darkness, because people would lean in and then they'd go blind. When the thing, and you'd see people squinting, and it was one of those that I thought, I wonder if the music can help or hinder any of that. Like if I can sort of soften the blow in a way that's ideal, that lets the visuals maybe push harder and make the whole thing not overly taxing, or maybe we work together to make it like push as hard as possible. And so just seeing what everyone else's sort of little battles are and trying to improve and turn those
This is one of the things that I think is so important. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to do this particular interview is because I love you and we've worked together for so long, but also
couldn't be more mutual.
But because people don't understand how important sound design and music is to game design. I see this with my students all the time, and I see it with young developers all the time. It happened on Journey. It happens on every game I work on, where a younger designer will build something, and it won't feel very good because it hasn't been tuned yet, and it doesn't have the right art, and it doesn't have sound. Yep. And then what they'll do is they'll go to the art team and they'll say, put this in and this in and this in and this in and add these particles and make it sparkle and turn up the brightness and also change the contrast exactly when this moment happens because it has to feel pow. Yep. And then you do all that and it looks like a Saturday morning cartoon. It's way too much. It's not subtle at all. And it's actually kind of gross. It's just harsh. And then you give it to the sound guy or the sound lady and they take a look at it and they go, you know what I think this needs? It needs a build-up, and then we need to do kind of a pop here, and then I'm going to bring in these strings, and then you can cut like half the graphics. Because all the stuff that you were filling the visual space with can be presaged by the music. You can hint at what's going to come, and then the music can really bring you through that moment.
Yeah, we can help the design.
It's so time-saving, and it's so important for emotionally guiding the player. You hear things long before you see them.
Plus, it lets you realize that the finished game is not a piece of interactive software that happens to have music playing in parallel. Like they are one unit that's all jumbled together. Like if you take a bunch of Play-Doh and you just smash everything until it's this omni-colored blob, that's what the finished game ideally is. And so if you're struggling, if your moment that you're trying to make is not working, but 2/3 of your components are not in there, it doesn't mean that your idea is broken or that the thing. It would be like you were regaling us with like 10 minutes of wonderful food porn before we started this thing.
I was talking about my meal at Somni last night, which is the best restaurant in LA and possibly one of the best restaurants
this
in the whole world.
This podcast brought to you by Somni.
Shout out to the chefs and shout out to Andreas and everyone at Somni because that food is amazing. But yes,
you have me definitely jonesing for it. But imagine, you were describing this like tempura encasing steak tartare. And it's
amazing.
like, imagine going to the butcher shop and taking like this bite of like bleeding raw steak and going, well, this doesn't taste like tempura tartare. Like that's kind of what people do. It's they look at this raw ingredient and they get all freaked out that it's not the finished product. And it's like, that's what we're here to do.
And they overcook it. That's the problem. They overcook the moment
high
visually.
heat, because
they
freaking
sear
out.
it. And then what you get is something that's a little bit too done. It doesn't have flavor. It doesn't have that kind of subtlety. And it really is about like building with the ingredients as you go along allows you to understand the interactivity in that space. So when we started to collaborate on Luna, I gave you a very specific goal on this project. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think that one of the things about Austin is that he's a fantastic collaborator across lots of projects, but there's a side of you that not everybody gets to see that I got to see on that project, right? So
not everybody. There's like a Robin side of me. Like it's like we would invariably, like our meetings are always,
like hours long.
Yeah, like 6 hours, and half of which is like walking on the beach and where maybe
or eating amazing food,
all right off of the beach. Yeah, and I feel like, and it's funny because there could easily be, there've been multiple times where there's like 30 minutes of almost barely speaking, also of just kind of reflecting and living in the sort of a moment. I mean, working on Luna took all the intensity and how personal Journey was, and then it's funny that even though it's probably objectively a smaller game,
it's much smaller.
For me, it was vastly more personal because you
goal.
wanted it to be for everyone on the team. That was the thing that was also so fascinating because on paper that shouldn't work. It shouldn't be possible that everybody makes it sort of about them.
Yeah.
Because at some point it would just be this perspectiveless thing because everyone's going to have a very different way of making it about them.
Yeah.
But somehow you managed to make that work in a way that I don't think I'll ever really fully understand or totally appreciate to the fullest because it's remarkable. But it made it emotionally. You're like my emotional physical trainer, where I'm always the better for it, but in the moment I'm hating you.
Yes, that's exactly
because
right.
it's gut wrenching and hard, and you're so uncompromising about your team, and particularly speaking for myself, of like digging into your shit, and asking these questions that you're afraid to even speak alone about, never mind to other people, never mind to make your work emblematic of it as much as possible. It's really intense.
So when we started the project, I went to Austin and I explained that I was going to be making a game that was about my own personal challenge with letting go of trauma in my past. I'm a sexual violence survivor, and I had wanted to make a game that was an allegory or a fairy tale about moving through changes and letting go of things in your life that feel like a mistake or feel like a trauma. But I didn't want it to be a traumatic game. I didn't want it to feel like this is a game about rape, or this is a game about violence, or this is a game about a car accident, or this is a game about losing a loved one. I wanted it to be something, or breakup. I wanted it to be all of those things, but also to be very beautiful and to be very healing in the sense that you could move through it, you could understand the story, and it would help you let go of something of your own. So not just make art to heal myself, but make art to heal everyone on the team, and hopefully everyone that played it that identified with that process, right?
Yeah, I liken it to like a Pixar film where if you're a 5-year-old kid, it's like this really charming, beautiful toy almost, interactive narrative toy. But
sculpture kind of is what we're calling it,
Yeah, and it actually really works on that level. And then if it's like Pixar or in a way almost like Shakespeare, where when you read it in high school, it's like, oh, okay, so first Henry V does this, says this, and it's like about the plot. And then as you get older, you start to see in between the actions and realize all the subtext and realize the characters, and then realize like all the metaphor that's being invoked and all the timeless mythology and all this stuff. And it takes like a lifetime to fully digest that. And that felt very much like the goal, because I remember thinking this has to be the very front edge of it, like of the experience should be very kind of charming and childlike. Yeah. But if you pause, and particularly the older you get, you start to recognize these themes, particularly the one we always spoke quite a lot about is the stages of grief.
Yeah.
Where that is in no way like charming, sweet, childlike stuff, but it is also extremely universal. And so you start to recognize that, and then you realize this game is not what it appears to be.
It's not even really a game, right? And so I went to Austin and I said, I'm going to be building this experience. This bird's going to get blown off course, and then we have to reconstruct their world. It's probably going to be on the iPad. Turned out it ended up being a VR title. But what I challenged Austin with was write a score about a trauma in your own life. Don't illustrate the game. I'm not going to give you the game and tell you to illustrate it the way that we did it with Journey. We're not going to do that. What I want you to do is I want you to write a piece of music that genuinely reflects you moving through something. And at the time that I did this, you were still married.
Yes.
And your father was still alive.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
the universe decided
to change everything.
Give me a lot of grief to help with Luna.
It was in the same way that like I think our lives were intertwined before we even knew it. It's like I came to you with the project, and then these holes in your life started to open up, and you had to move through a process of really learning how to confront this stuff, because you're a very upbeat person. You work a lot. You're very directed. You had been going like at a nonstop clip up until the time that this happened, right?
Yeah.
And then it just like was kind of like bam.
It was very much that I was used to working hard all the time and loving it, and being grateful to have opportunities to do that. And I wasn't just at home writing music for the sake, but and especially after Journey had come out, that opened up a lot of opportunities. And so I was working, and I was still learning the kind of fundamental life lessons about how much I should righteously take, not for the sake of what I can handle, but for the sake of my availability and my presence with the people I'm working with, because I had grown so much as a human from Journey through those interactions with you, with Matt, with Genova, Kelly, everybody, that I didn't want to sacrifice that just because there were opportunities.
That's right.
So, but I was still learning that, because it's like there's a lot of really exciting things. It's hard to say no when someone shows you a game like the Banner Saga or something, and you're like, wow, that is amazing and inspiring, and it's like the kind of game I loved growing up and all that sort of stuff. So I was in the midst of that. So it's like a machine that's running at full bore, and then it's like a starship where the engineer says, by the way, there's like a cable that's loose, and if we stop the ship, it's going to like cause a chain reaction that makes it explode, but we can't keep running because this cable is loose. And so you realize like you have this momentum, and it's really difficult to figure out how are we safely going to kind of power this down. And the real world way of saying that is that I didn't have any space allotted for the intrusion of life events.
Exactly.
And so it was like, I remember I got... We started, and I started coming up with musical explorations, and I was very convinced that it was going to be this kind of rustic folk score, almost like the kind of stuff that Darren Korb does for Supergiant, like Bastion. I was really hearing like this earthy, something very intimate and very quiet, and
it's
guitar.
It's in the first trailer, the very first trailer, like the very first look trailer that we did from Indiecade years ago has that music in it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was really sure that was the sound. Funny enough, maybe I knew at the time, and I just have forgotten since, but I don't remember kind of what made it feel like that's Luna for sure. But then, as my life begins to unravel, somewhere in the midst of that, I remember it was like the peak version of everything happened on almost the same day, where I was offered Assassin's Creed Syndicate, which was just this enormous amount of work. And my father calls and says, at best, I have 2 years to live, probably less. It turned out it was like 6 weeks.
It was so fast.
Yeah, it was one of those, went from the absolute healthiest, most fit mid-60s you could ever imagine to just being gone.
Yeah, just gone.
And so I was out for almost a month. And you, of course, were the most sort of understanding and gracious.
Really difficult time for you,
but to their credit, even Ubisoft, I mean, it was literally my first meeting was like 5 days after he died. And they were like, do what you got to do.
Yeah,
we got your
off.
back. Yeah. They were super, super accommodating and generous. And they had fortunately hired me early enough that we had this runway. But But overall, my life was like this house of cards that exploded apart.
Yeah.
And it was like I fell behind on everything.
Yeah.
And
I
I
remember
left no space for
I remember
life.
this. I remember this period of time being like, you have to take the space now, because if you don't take the space now, your battery is going to get down to the bottom and you're not going to be able to get back out, right? And I was literally on a podcast yesterday. I was on the Funomena podcast, and we were talking with a bunch of developers about burnout, and I was saying the same thing, which is that it's so easy when you're young and you're working on games to get so excited about something that you're like, I got to do this. I got to do this. And then it's, I got to do this. I'm going to stay late. I'm going to stay late. I'm going to stay late. And then your first Christmas home or your first Hanukkah home, you go home and you immediately get a cold or the flu, and you fall sick, and you're sick the whole break, and you're like, wow, that sucked. But then you multiply that times 10 years, and what you get is your battery can never get up past 30 or 40%. You don't even know how to take a vacation. You don't know how to go to the beach and sit still and not think about work. You don't know how to not check your phone. You don't know how to not tweet, right? And you're so busy, and especially for freelancers, I think this is an incredibly scary and very attractive, tar pit that you can get stuck in.
Oh, for sure.
Because you feel like, I got to generate business.
Yeah. Well,
I want to be part of the community. I want to be contemporary.
Yep.
I got to do these contracts. I got to excel. But at the same time, life events happen. Like losing your parent is like one of the hardest things a person can go through. And if you don't have any flexibility in that space, like that's, you're just, at some point, your body is going to say no, right?
Oh yeah, no, your body and soul, and I was very quickly spiraling into a very intense depression, and it affected me for years. I mean, I probably will be part of me forever, because it's like I'm marked, and things will set me off randomly in ways where it'll take me back, and I'll think, I thought I'd made more progress than this. But it just makes you realize that you.
That's it. That's the whole point of Luna, and that's the whole point of the process, right? Is that you get marked, and then you need to let it go.
Yep. Even though you can't ever fully, like you will let go of the parts that should be, and you'll try to be better for the parts that are going to stick with you,
Yeah.
And so that was, and I'll never forget what happened was, as you mentioned, also my marriage was kind of unraveling also.
Yeah.
Long-term relationship. By the time we were officially separated, it was 17 years. And so this was a few years before all that. And I remember there was this experience where I was also finding myself just not overly happy with any of the music in Luna. It was one of those where it was like, it was all fine, but I didn't feel like I was doing justice to the questions you were asking. In fact, I remember one that you posed once that I feel like I'm going to be trying to answer this for the rest of my life in everything that I do, which you said, why do we do things that we know are wrong?
That are bad for us.
That are bad for us. Why, but do them nonetheless.
Yeah,
we go in
anyway.
fully acknowledging that, and not the simple, obvious stuff like heroin or something where you're like, this is probably a bad idea, but whatever.
Most people don't do that, right?
Well, true, yeah. It's like sometimes little decisions and sometimes major things where you just think some impulse is overriding like the intellect or whatever that's putting up this flag, and rather than sort of beating yourself up and then creating this kind of mess that's just going to cause you to do it more, you just own it and say. And so it was one of those, you remember you posed like, I want the score to be your attempt to answer that question. So I remember we were driving around in Venice when you said that, and I was grappling with all this stuff and struggling and wanting, because I just didn't want my life to fly apart basically, and it was right on the edge. And I remember what happened was I had managed to get asked to do this performance in this thing called MagFest in Washington, D.C. And it was in January of like 2016. And it was because, so at that point we were, more than halfway through Luna at that point. We were getting relatively close to the finish line.
It shipped in October of 2017.
So there was like a good year and 10 months still to go. I don't think we knew that at the time. It was still like, oh, it's coming out in a month. But I remember I had proposed this show. I had met this this artist and commissioned some paintings of her, and then discovered she could speed paint amazingly. Angela Bermudez from Costa Rica, and I had commissioned for our mutual friend Jordan Vogt Roberts. I commissioned a painting for his birthday. I commissioned it for another friend of mine. as well. And I was blown away. And then I discovered she could do this kind of performance art where she speed paints in like 30 minutes. So I pitched this festival asked me, do you have any ideas? We'd love to have you come perform. And we had done Journey Live there the year before and it had gone really well. So I said, what if I did this improvised performance where I play piano and she paints and we don't discuss what we're going to do. We just feel each other in the moment and just express ourselves. And the funny thing was, it was just this idea kind of off the cuff. I had no idea how much it was teeing me up for what I needed on Luna and for what was missing, because this had to be pitched, 5 months before the actual event. It's like GDC or anything else where there's a long lead time.
Thread. It was just a little bit of a subconscious thread of like, what if I'm not on a script, but I'm doing something more from inside?
Yeah, I think my subconscious impulse was a lot of the emergent depression was stemming from this increasing feeling of losing control. Yeah. So it's like, what if I put myself in a situation where there's no such thing as control? But I couldn't have ever said that. In fact, I've never said that before this moment, that might have been what was so revelatory about this experience. But I know that heading into December, because the thing was in January, heading into December, all of December that year of 2015.
You were like on the couch.
I would go into my studio. I would race there in the morning. I'd wake up with a rampant heartbeat at 4 a.m. and be like, oh my God, I have so much to do. And I would rush into the studio and I'd lie on my couch and I'd leave at 11 o'clock at night and I'd do nothing the whole day. And it was an entire month of that. Yeah. And I had some, I don't want to drag this down, but there was some suicidal, right to the edge. I mean, I was as low as I could ever imagine. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. It was the weirdest, total non-sensation. And I almost canceled this MagFest thing because I was just like, I didn't care.
Can't do it, yeah.
And I showed up and she was so excited. She'd only been to the US once and she'd never been there to paint because she also was doing cosplay as kind of a hobby and did like a Comic-Con in Houston or something. So it was like she was bursting with excitement, and I felt immediately guilty because I was like, I can't believe I almost canceled because she is so wired for the. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to try to rally and do something. And it was like the moment I sat at the piano and there's all these people crowded around us. I mean, we did 2 performances. The first one, like 1,500 people showed up, and so you kind of get on this adrenaline from that and sit down at the piano, and it's kind of like I was describing working with you on Journey where. And before that on Flow, where all the world seemed to change immediately. And part of the problem before that and what was fueling the depression was that I was working on a game where I was really struggling to get anything over the line. It's like everything I did, the director hated. Yeah. And at some point it started to feel like my one safe harbor in life, after things fall apart with friends, family, relationships, music was always my little cove, right? And then now it was like this horse trying to buck me off because nothing I could do worked. I hated it. They hated it. It was all terrible. And I thought my career, I texted my agent. I said, this might be my last project. I might be done after this and just do something different with my life. And kind of got talked off the ledge with that, worked my way by the skin of my teeth through that project, showed up at this thing. And then it was like I rediscovered what music was. And it completely changed everything. And so immediately after that experience, I remember I came home and I had also, in the midst of losing my father, lost one of my best friends. Like 5 days, it was actually just last week was the 4-year, I think, anniversary of her dying. And so here we are 6 months later. And I remember we had talked so much about Luna as a exploration of grief. And each animal in the game kind of representing the different stages of grief and our own manifestation. And so I remember I said, I've never liked the idea of improvisation as a compositional tool because it's like muscle memory. It's not heart and soul. It's like what my fingers just want to do because they've played certain patterns, And it's different from like someone who's a champion, tennis player or something where they get those muscle memory is why they're good. To me, the best improvisers are like Neo in the Matrix, because this is the Keanu E3, right? So you transcend your own patterns and things like that. If you're really amazing,
super conscious.
Yeah, but I was, I guess bound by my very real limitations that I could improvise, well enough to feel confident at it, but I always underestimated. And then this experience with Angela painting, I felt like music happened that felt like I was just in another universe, and you were leading from your body and from your feelings as opposed to from your head. Yeah, right? and exactly. It wasn't intellectualized. It was very spontaneous. So I said, okay, I'm going to throw out 100% of the music in Luna. It's all going in the trash, and I booked a recording studio. Again, I'm also used to leaning on the technology where it's like I play something in and it records the MIDI and it's almost like a transcription of the sheet music. For those that don't understand that, like everything is there down to the minutest detail. I can tell, the MIDI velocities break down 127 gradients. So it's like if I play a note, I can
exactly
tell you how hard I hit that key with 127 degrees of sort of nuance. And so I was used to working in that kind of a space.
Yeah.
And so I said, I'm going to just throw everything away. I went and I booked a recording studio. There's this woman who I've worked with many times named Lynn Earls, who had this beautiful little upright piano that was like, nice, but not too nice. And it was like a person that's beautiful, but they've got like miles on their face. Like you can see like mileage, like they've lived and seen the world. And I liked that about her little studio just in her backyard. And so I went in there and I booked it for like 3 hours. And I said, after you hit record, can you leave? So I'm 100% alone in the building. And I remember I put photos of Glenn's art of the animals and the environments up on the piano on my laptop. And then I put a photo of my father and a photo of Claire. And I played for 2 hours relentlessly. And it was like my fingers were practically bleeding. Like we got to some of the like kind of the bare moments and because I would kind of try to vaguely guide it. I'd play for a while and then I just kind of look up and I'd move along the progression. And by the end I was like pounding the piano and like sweating and practically screaming. And again, it was after this 2 hour, I had this long recording. It would have been very interesting if she had not hit record. And it was just this major sort of pure experiment. But I had this recording and I was like, okay, now I have to go into this. Yeah. It's like confronting it because I spilled all of myself out onto the table. And then I had to go in and find the gems that were usable within this spontaneous create, and all of the score to Luna then subsequently came from that. My original thought was, what if I can somehow use this recording? But it was so.
I love that recording. I still do.
Well, it was so kind of.
It was
crazy.
Very raw. It was so raw. It had so much quality. The quality without a name, Quan.
It just,
so much rawness.
It just explored and searched. And because there were no parameters, like, okay, I searched, but I got to be out of here at 2 or whatever. It was like, I had enough window of a time that I thought, I'll just play as much as I feel that I need. And I'll know when I'm there. And so, and it was exactly that. And I've never done that before or since. And, and then spent the rest of the next, obviously, year and a half, we chiseled away at Luna and worked on it and owe an enormous amount to Brad, our sound designer and everything, sound guru, genius. Helped also a lot in figuring out ways to kind of use it to fit, because Luna's also not mechanically, like you said, it's arguable if it is a game.
Yeah, it's kind of like the way I like to describe it to people is that it's a sculptural interactive experience where everything you touch plays sounds and music, and you're guiding a character through a story arc, but you don't necessarily think of it as a puzzle or as a game. You think of it as an experience, like almost like a snow globe that you can kind of poke at. And actually what's interesting is that for this release, for the PlayStation release, we've updated the build with a narrative track that more explicitly talks through the bird's journey, which I think really adds a layer of recognition to the story and allows it to be a little less abstract. And I think in my personal opinion, I think it really makes the music shine.
It was, that was when I realized that you guys did that, or that was going to be the plan, I was really impressed that it was like all this time and still finding ways to let it express its ideal self. But I never had a chance to ask you, what was the turning point in making that decision to say, you know what, let's actually add this sort of narrator.
So I had made the whole game, as you said, I can be pretty intense and pretty focused on my goals. And one of my goals was to not have a talking track on the game because I wanted people to bring their own narrative to it.
Exactly.
And, everyone that worked on the game did an exercise where they went into their own sort of core and asked themselves, what's something that when I think about it, I feel a scribble in my belly, like something that's uncomfortable? And what is that thing? why am I feeling that way? And what if I let it go, what would that mean to me? Right? That was kind of an exercise we all did. And everyone on the team, every person that contributed, Brad, Glenn, Elena, Elise, everybody, even Eddie, who came onto the project fairly late, was asked to kind of like think about this, and at the end of the game to add a phrase that reflected back on their experience. And I think I wanted everyone to have space, and I didn't want any one script to dictate what the story was. So we shipped the game. It came out for the Oculus and Steam and also Windows Mixed Reality. And then we kind of shelved it for a while, and we worked on another project with Magic Leap, which was an extension of the universe. And by the time we got to that project, Dan Clegg had come on board. He's a voice actor and a writer, and he wrote a little talk track for the Magic Leap experience because it was just kind of like we wanted to be like a storybook. And it was about the fox and the bird. And the fox is basically in a depression, sad. And what you do in the game is that you build the world around the fox out so that it wants to come out of its little hole. And listening to him reading the story, I realized this is what we needed. We needed Dan, who had nothing to do with the production, to come in, experience the game, know the backstory of it, and then write the story for us. No single one of us could have written the narrative. So it's really Dan's story.
It's kind of like we were saying earlier
of the story, yeah.
The objectivity by kind of being outside of it let him see it for what it actually is, despite all of our intentions to make it whatever it was.
Yeah, and it really transforms that.
I didn't realize it was World that catalyzed that somehow.
It was. And so Moondust Garden, we built that and we shipped it, and we had such a positive experience with adults listening to this little fairy tale. They would get down and like talk to the fox and say, "Don't be sad," and stuff like this, because they had this narrative in their head about where the fox was, which you never would have been able to get out of, a 3 inches high, virtual object in real 3D space, right? Like the other necessity was that working on the Magic Leap, because you're putting these characters into your real world space, there's less suspension of disbelief, and you need to bring it forward even more. And the other thing I realized is that virtual reality, especially for people who haven't had VR experiences, has that same quality. You need to bring them along a little bit more. Like a game like Journey succeeds without having any narrative, because people who play it are skilled at reading narrative from a world space.
Yeah.
But when you put people in VR, suddenly those skills all almost disappear. And it's like you have to
It'll
start
be a long
over.
time before that's second nature.
Yeah, it's much closer to the LucasArts types of games that you were talking about earlier. That's kind of where we need to be with game direction in VR. We need to be building skills in our community of players rather than expecting them to be where they are with 3D games projected in a 2D space. We need to rebuild that skill set. And so I relaxed my understanding of what was appropriate for the game, both in terms of authority, like thinking of who has the authority to tell the story of Luna, and also the player's ability to put their own story in, even though they're being told something. And all of the experiences that we've had with it since we put the narrative directly in have been, it's as if you added that extra little sea salt on top of the caramel. It just adds that little bit of dimension that causes people to go over the top. And it's been really, really fantastic. I'm like thrilled. It's not often the case that you get to make a game and release it and then release it again.
Right.
And a lot of developers wish you could, like Journey's just come out for the PC. It just came out on the Epic Store this week.
Yeah.
And that allows us to share the game with millions of people that would never have touched it, right?
Yep.
It's going to be outstanding, and I'm so glad. But it's still the same game that it was. We didn't go back and fix all the little things that drive me nuts about it.
Oh, yeah. That would be exciting. But
because we just can't. And there was even a whole sound pass that Steve did that didn't make it into the final build because we were so close to cert that we couldn't do it. And Martin wouldn't let it into the build. And so there were
Martin's obviously a jerk.
Well, poor Martin, he was just like, sorry, I can't put the build at risk. But like when we looked at Luna and got ready to release it on the PlayStation, it was like, wow, we could really add a dimension to this for PSVR that players hadn't seen, and then we'll just backport it to everything else. So now if you buy it, no matter what platform you get it on, it'll have that quality. And for me, it's like, it was just like to little dot the I's and cross the T's and build out something that now really does say what I think it should say. I mean, to be honest, letting go of the narrative of why I made it, letting go of my experiences and the guilt and the shame that I felt about the things that happened to me when I was so young. Like I don't even know if working through the game was enough. Like you said, there was a period where we were working on it really intensely, and then I kind of left it. I had a friend, a really close friend, right around the time that Luna shipped, that went through a similar kind of depression and breakdown due to a life event that broke down the barriers. Almost exactly the same scenario you're talking about. Overworked, really relying on themselves far too much. Not a very good network of friends and family to support them in that time, and then just breaking down. And so in a way, what happened for me was I shipped Luna, and then I immediately went to help this friend. I became basically their family for about a year and a half. And then they left the nest and kind of emerged. And then we had the opportunity to reship Luna. And I feel like it's actually kind of acted as bookends on this particular experience with my friend, who I love dearly and I'm so proud of. And I don't think that we could have gotten to where we got to if we hadn't had that time. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately as we work on our next games, especially thinking about building like a live game or an online game with an active community, is just how much space that gives you to continually touch back to the concepts in a game and the themes of a game, and to really almost like to grow with it like a relationship. That's my goal now, is to build a game where I'm having a relationship with the community and the game itself that goes on for a long time. You know, like I really want to see what happens now when you take the process that we had on Journey and on Luna, and then you apply it to a community of people. Like, can I become as connected to a community as I have to you through making this game?
Yeah.
You know, is that possible? I kind of think it is, and I think it has
Were it
the
not for
potential.
Journey, I would have been
potential
more
to heal.
skeptical.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I think it really does.
Everyone always just assumes, you know, that it's just impossible to weed out the trolls, but it all comes down to design in part, but also with Journey, and it blew my mind the extent to which, if you appeal to people's better angels of their nature, they love that actually, like, because it's so fulfilling. So yeah, I don't think that there's. I mean, every design is wrought with incredible challenge, so I'm sure that will prove to be mind-bogglingly difficult to do. But so are these others. But I love so much. I hadn't realized until just now those steps that you went through to get to that point of, like, so fully embracing the idea behind Luna that you would then even let it go entirely to somebody else's sort of interpretation.
Absolutely.
That then becomes like the canonized, this is what players will experience. I mean, you had to truly let her fly from the nest fully, which, you know, I knew that this had been added, and I've, ever since I love seeing, like, on Twitter, the retweets when someone experiences it for the first time and shares it, and someone like you or the Funomena account re-shares it, and I'm always, it's been amazing to see that pivot when that became part of the experience, and you could really see the difference in the intensity of people's response and all that. But I didn't realize that kind of backstory behind it, and it's just so perfectly Luna.
It's the way things are, right? Like, we have these ideas about what music will be when we're sitting down to the piano, or what a game will be when we're sitting down in our notebook, drawing out a level design, or sketching a character. When I was writing some of the backstory for these characters and looking at the stages of grief, looking at early childhood traumas and ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, and thinking about how those affect us all through our lives. Every development process is the same, in that it begins with this idea of what you want to put into the world, the energy that you want to put in, the passion and the fear and the anger and the love and the regret. Everything that's in Luna comes from real people. And then it goes out into the world and it touches people and it creates an experience, right? And games, like music, like any art, shape our ability to communicate. Not just by making them, but by experiencing them, you know?
Absolutely.
So as you look at your career now, moving forward, what do you think are the tools that you took from this dark time, from this period of transformation? Are you less controlling now? Do you have
without a doubt.
Do you have more of an openness to uncertainty? Do you feel like, you know, you're more open to not doing everything perfect? Like, where are you there?
It's all the above. I definitely, you know, the relaxation of control and also kind of like what you were saying about the goals with the next game, I have also found myself increasingly drawn to how can I create experiences, whether they're live as a performer, that break down the barrier with the audience. Like that experience with Angela, we've been now doing that show all over the place for like 2 years straight. We did it in Croatia where we saw you at Reboot, and we did it a couple times in Lithuania. We did it in London. Did it, doing it all over, and experimenting with different ways to involve the audience and bring in other performers with us to kind of change the dynamic for everybody internally, and just keep finding ways to inject more sort of chaos into it, basically, to see where it takes us. And as you would expect, sometimes I listen, I think about it, and I'm like, I don't think I played anything interesting for that whole show. And she'll hate the painting and be like, this is going in the trash. But then there's other times where it's like people come up to us in tears, and it won't be surprising, because it's like somehow you end up in this out of body experience where you feel it as if you're not the author of it, and that has become increasingly sort of my obsession. And it's funny because I remember when I was in school and I would read interviews from people like John Cage, who talked about he doesn't really see himself as a composer because the authorial aspect of it is not interesting. He would rather be almost like this conduit for the universe to just use. And I remember reading that and being like, he's so full of shit. And here I am 10 years like, how do I be a conduit for the universe? Because I'm increasingly uninterested. I'm like bored by Austin Wintory. So how do I just make that like a vessel? And this improvisatory thing, we've been working, like the actor Troy Baker, we're working on putting together one where he's improvising a narration.
Oh, that's amazing. And
so it's like, then there's this whole other dimension that we don't have all of us are terrified because we have like no idea what's going to happen there. So, and each one of those informs, the work that I'm also doing. And one theme that existed way before, even before Journey, was I was always interested in projects that I could say afterward, I didn't know I know how to do that. Like I didn't know I had that in me, maybe because I just didn't. And this project helped create that in me. And so it's like I owe the game this score as opposed to some reverse of that. And so always on the hunt also for things that will take me somewhere that I feel like I haven't been, you know, because particularly because, it's like you do something like Journey or you do something like Luna and it really digs down in. And I think I don't want to in a way, I don't know how to phrase it, like be dismissive of what I got from that. I don't want to like prostitute.
You don't want to productize that experience.
Yeah, or like
exactly.
commoditize it somehow and be like, oh, I'm just going to channel in the old grief machine, or whatever. Like I have to find new areas where I'm like undeveloped as a person and hope because I can't just find that and then look for a game to fill that slot. It's more like look at a game and say, what can I bring to this that will actually make me be someone better than I am?
It's funny. I went to see, is it Hannah Gadsby, the woman that did Nanette? She's an amazing comedian, and that first Nanette is a very amazing. It's an amazing piece. It's comedy, but it's also spoken word.
This is the Netflix special. Yeah. I actually haven't seen this, but
it's stunning. It's really great.
I heard it's also for a stand-up comedy special. It's also starkly intense.
It is. It has a very intense period in it. And then I went to see her recently in San Francisco talking about a completely different topic. And in the monologue she's giving at the beginning, she's talking about like, well, I'm a comedian and I'm supposed to, follow the format. But if I made everything like Nanette, like nobody would ever come to my shows because it'd be too intense. Yeah. But then she does end up going to a place in that show, and I'm not going to give it away because if you can see it, you should see it.
Yeah, it's on the list.
Or watch it. But like in both shows, she's referencing themes that you would not necessarily associate with comedy. And there's an explicit point in the second show where she says exactly how she's going to end the show, and you don't know she's doing it. And then at the end of the show, she ends the show exactly the way that she's telecast to you. She's like broadcasts it to you. At some point, I'm going to end the show, and you're going to be like, what? And then it'll happen. And it happens, and you're just overwhelmed with emotion.
I love that.
Because you feel like you know yourself so well and you're building this platform for yourself and you're growing with everyone. And I think it really moved me. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And it's so brave of her as a person who is queer and living with the challenges that she's lived through and the things that she's learned about herself recently. She's really, she's an advocate for people who are maybe not neurotypical, people that have lifestyles that look very different from what normal seemed to be when she was growing up.
Yeah.
And I just have an immense amount of respect for her for that reason. And like, this is the thing that games now can do and are doing in a way that like, comedy didn't used to do this, and now it's doing it, right? We're in the Me Too era. We're in the age of radical inclusion. We're in the pre-climate disaster world. We're in the end, the sort of the dark times of capitalism. We're in these places, and our media is going to reflect that more and more and more. And I feel like games are actually, along with some forms of spoken word and comedy entertainment and like interactive entertainment, we're at the forefront of that because the audience is part of it and they're already feeling the change, right? Like we can't ignore it. You can't just give people the same fantasy that they were getting in their Saturday morning cartoons anymore. Like
absolutely.
People are not going to buy it. Like they need to see something to reflect what they're feeling and thinking about the world, especially Gen Z, like, and millennials. I hate those labels, but people that are younger than us and have seen the world through the eyes of everyone on the internet for years and years and years, and grown up aware of the fact that we are so fragile and we're so connected. Like games, I feel like, are one of the most flexible and responsive mediums to that situation because of this connection with the audience.
I was gonna say a similar point. I think that something that gives games an interesting leg up on basically all other forms of media, if you want to just put this really broad term, because even including like authors, novelists or poets or stage performers, be they stand up or like people, like I know an actress who has a one-woman show, like whatever you're going to label all the kind of performance arts and all that kind of stuff. There's a certain amount of long-winded sort of development process, and you also have to just vie for some kind of platform. Like not everyone's going to get a Netflix special or but so games are, they're transmissible over the internet. So the barrier to reaching people is exponentially smaller than all these others. And you can make, look at someone like Jason Rohr, you can make a really powerful and evocative piece of art that communicates something personal alone. If you need
it can be 5 minutes long.
Exactly. It can be, and it can be grand in scope in every way, or you can have your Call of Duties or Assassin's Creeds that take years of development time and like thousands of people, and then you can also have someone at home who just asks themselves questions, puts something together, and just puts it up on their website as like if you have an extra and want to send me some PayPal, I'd appreciate it.
Exactly.
And it's
pay what you will.
Yeah, and so to me, games, I don't know of any other medium ever at any point in history, now or previous, that has that degree, that massive spectrum. But then also that ability, because you can have someone like Mike Bithell did Subsurface Circular, because he said, "Can I make a game in like 5 months or whatever?" And
he was one of my interviews.
And I know, I loved that interview.
He's so funny. Hi, Mike.
And I see like that model of saying, okay, I spent years making the first few games, and then now, almost as a creative exercise, can I do that? But then you end up learning something. I remember I talked to him after he did Subsurface, and he goes, I asked him, what did you learn from that experience, that extreme turnaround and all that? Like, what would be the biggest takeaway? And he goes, I've finally allowed myself to just admit that I'm a writer more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's actually not a small thing at all. It would be like me saying, it turns out I'm not really a composer. That's a skill I have, but I'm a performer or whatever, or something. Exactly. It's a kind of a huge shift in identity to own, because it's going to shape everything you do from that point forward. So here, this little scope thing, little in relative terms, 6 months, for most people, 6 months to do something is not small, but still in our terms, that's pretty quick. And to arrive at a revelation like that, to me, that's unique to games. So it's like every project, try to find whatever that thing is.
Yeah,
try
what's going to make you closer to whole, maybe, or like closer to what you. I mean, like, I guess if you were to say it that way, like, I guess what I realized making Luna and building Funomena is that I love to build community. I love to create safe spaces for people, in the true sense of the word, and that they are places where you can bring your whole self. You can be as gay, as trans, as trashy as you want to be.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and like you can be whoever
you
can be whoever you want, and you can feel appreciated because your perspective is valued. And I really, really love that. Like I love being able to, even if you look at the program that I built at UC Santa Cruz, it's the same thing. Like I started Funomena and the program at Santa Cruz at the same time, and my marriage had just fallen apart, and I was suddenly single and like a whole life ahead of me with no kids, which was not the plan. And I really thought about, well, what do I want to do? And I was like, well, I want to have a community of people that I work with every day that I love, and I want to give something back. So I'm going to build this community at school. And we just had our game showcase actually last week, and we're graduating everyone on Thursday, which is why I'm leaving E3 early, so I can go home and say goodbye to my seniors, who I just spent a year with. And at the showcase, I was like in tears for a lot of it, like just looking at their games. Some of them are so beautiful and tender, and some of them are so fun, and some of them are so immersive, and some of them are so wacky. And like there's such a broad spectrum of experience enabled just by that group of 180 kids. And like
There's 180 seniors?
180 seniors across both programs that collaborate to make their games.
Wow.
Yeah. And they're great. They're amazing. They're so great. And like they're going out into the world now with the skill set that you and I have that took us so long to build.
Yeah,
they've already gotten started on the path. You know, think about how much more actualized they'll be in 10 years than we were at 25 or 30.
And not just, and hopefully not just in terms of skills. Like that's one of the things when I go and talk to composition programs, I end up going off on topics like this more, where I say, look, there's going to be a lot of composers passing through here that tell you, here's how you write, here's how you use the trumpet, and blah 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 blah. And then I say, ultimately, I don't like to talk about anything that a YouTube tutorial could replace me doing. Like, and that's super learnable, and that's cool. I love that. It's like the barriers to learning all these skills are virtually nothing, and that's exciting because it enables everyone to have a voice, and there's no one sort of anywhere in the world that's. I mean, there's obviously still corners that need to be reached, but it's by far the most inclusive industry that I think, creative industry at least, that has ever yet existed. And it's only getting more so, especially with people like you and plenty others who are, that's part of their agenda. It's not even this side effect or something, but they're like, that's the point. And same thing when talking to composition students, where I say, figure out, like, make each gig, make that word feel weird, because that makes it seem like, a gig is like Sunday night, I go play a jazz club for, 2 hours,
for tips and
that's
beer.
And that's where those kinds of phrases come from. And I'm like, think of everything as like this little incubator for you to, or laboratory for you to explore something about yourself. And it's not every game or film or whatever they're doing is going to give them the platform to like put themselves under this perfect sort of emotional CAT scan, right? And just try to get full diagnostic. Like Journey
takes a lifetime.
Journey and Luna both were inordinately broad in their introspective vomiters.
Yeah.
But most games, it's like, no, this is letting me explore, like I did a game that Devolver published called Absolver. That's like this martial arts, it's like this beautiful martial arts ballet game.
Cool.
And it was just really beautiful, special little thing. And it was one of those where I was able to look at it and very specifically target, can I explore what it feels like to dance dangerously and brutally, like where it is dangerous, but it's also beautiful. Like, is it possible to look at a knife pointed at you and appreciate the beauty of the construction of that knife? Is that, and then so it's like, it's a martial arts. It's essentially a multiplayer fighting game done in this extraordinarily artful way, but it is fundamentally that. So I'm not trying to kind of like make everything just this soul, dredge up the bottom of the lake kind of situation, but still asking myself, can I think about this deeper?
Yeah, how can I grow?
How can I make it not just like, it would be cool, loud drums or something, like, let's try to go further with it. And that's, we learn that.
Do something new, right? That's the thing that I always say to my students, is what I say to everyone on the teams. we were having a conversation just a couple days ago about a VR title that we've been working on, where we were coming up with an interface for an audiovisual experience. We were trying to tune into a channel, basically trying to see through a portal. And we had this ball and then 3 balls that like constellate around it, and you're moving them with controllers, and you're trying to focus the visual on the portal and then have them almost move them unconsciously. And I realized like we were designing a new form of dial, like a new interface for the dial on the stereo, where you're trying to tune into a radio station. It's 3-dimensional, it's in virtual reality, it's in front of you. And we were having this conversation where like all 8 of us were like staring at the screen, and one person was playing, and then we take the headset off and give it to someone else, and having this long conversation. And it's like that kind of work is why I make video games. It's like so fun to look at this stuff, but it's also like you don't even have a language to do it at some point. And like I think it's the same when we work on music together. It's like there's a point where on Luna I kept saying there's a song by Khruangbin that I love called I think it's August 19. And it has a solo at the end that's extremely crunchy and gets very frayed. The longer he plays the guitar, the more the notes become wild. And I remember playing it for Brad over and over and over again and being like, what is the word for what he's doing? And he's like rocking out. I'm like, no. I mean, like, what is the word for distorting the guitar in this way? And he's like, well, he's using I'm like, I know, but there's got to be a phrase for what what the audio is. What is the audio doing right now? It's like, to me, it's getting frayed, and then he's bringing it back together at the very end. And that fraying quality and then threading things back together was what I wanted to have in the score. And like those conversations are like, you're developing a way of communicating that you didn't have access to before, you know? So like, I guess in thinking about like wrapping up and like what you want to do moving forward, are you most looking for new vocabulary? Are you looking for new experiences? Are you really looking to become more of a conduit? Like what kind of projects do you want now?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. It is looking for new experiences, but knowing what that actually means. I always said that. Even before Journey, even before Flow, I probably would have said that because it's very attractive on paper. But you don't know what that really can mean because it's actually not a pleasant experience overall. It's very scary to be somewhere truly unknown. You know, it's like, I'm going to go explore the world. So I'm going to go stay at a 5-star resort in Bali with like people attending to my every need. It's like, not really on the frontier exactly, you know, like this is a very manicured experience. Right. And that's beautiful and great. And like, no one hates that. But at the same time, I wanted to really kind of be more like, what would it be like musically to feel, you know, like Matt Damon in The Martian, you know, like where can I be somewhere where I feel like I've probably got this, but I also might die, and probably will die, but like I'm pretty sure I can maybe make it.
You know what Pema Chadron calls this is it's the in between place.
Yeah.
You know, when you're between things, when things are uncertain. She has an amazing book, which I think I recommended to you.
Yeah, no, it's still on my desk to this day.
When things fall apart. Yeah. And she talks about being in the in-between place. And she says that the heart of bodhicitta, which is the ability to be present with uncertainty and in compassion and love with oneself, is that willingness to stay, to be in the uncertain place and to just stay with it, let go of the storyline and just be with a raw emotion. And like, that experience that you had at the piano was just staying, right? And so I just wanted to say thank you, Austin, for saying
no, thank you.
You made my game so beautiful with the work that you did, and I appreciate you.
Well, I feel the same. I feel very lucky to have had the opportunities that I do, and when inevitably I face my next existential crisis and I'm convinced my life and career is over, I will, if nothing else, I will reflect on the extremely lucky path I've had up till then. So, and I owe so much of that to you.
Love you.
Love you too. That's how all these end.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.